Hello from the gutter and welcome back to Ruthless Metal. In today's episode of Rank 'Em All, we're going to rank Overkill's full discography. And Overkill is an American thrash metal band that has been around for ages. So far they have released 19 studio albums and we're going to rank them all here today, from the worst to the best. And Overkill is an old favorite of mine, so I think I have a good understanding of their discography. So hopefully you guys will agree with my choices here today, at least to some degree. And if you want to avoid being rotten to the core, why not help me out by smashing that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on. And now it's time to take a deep dive, head first, into Overkill's discography. The worst Overkill album is, in my opinion, From the Underground and Below. And this album came out in '97. And the reason why I hold this album as the weakest, it's because it seems so dated by now. It really sounds like it came out in the 90s. Because there are some groove metal tendencies on this record. Plus, the songs on this album is rather forgettable. I also remember buying this album when it came out in an old CD store. Yeah, those were the days. Sadly, the album didn't impress me that much, but I had already bought some other Overkill records. So I wasn't going to dump the band just because of one bad record. So for me, From the Underground and Below is the worst Overkill disc. Next. And the same can be said about Necroshine from '99. It's the same era of Overkill. And during the late 90s and a bit into the 2000s, Overkill had a very chunky sound and groovier riffs. I prefer the band when they play a bit faster, and there are a few weird sounding tracks on Necroshine. And it's a rather forgettable album overall. Next. In 17th place we have Bloodletting from the year 2000. And it also has a shade of groove metal to it. This album don't do that much for me personally. It's just one of those Overkill albums that I don't really listen to anymore. And I'm not even sure if I bought this one, at least I haven't really listened to it since it came out. But of course I've given it some extra spins while compiling this list, but I must unfortunately say that Bloodletting is a highly skippable album. Bloodletting was the band's first album with Dave Linsk, who has been a constant member ever since. Next. In 16th place we have ReliXIV, Relix 14. I guess it's Relics, and then some Roman numerals, which says 14. So Overkill thinks of this album as their 14th studio album, because they count their debut EP as an album. So it's technically their 13th studio album. And Relics was released in 2005, when Overkill still experimented a bit with groove metal. The songwriting is kinda lame on this album, but Relics ain't as weird as From the Underground and Below and Necroshine. So for that reason, I like it a little more. Next. In 15th place we have Immortalis, and this album came out in 2007. And now we can start to hear some minor improvements. We are definitely moving towards the sound that Overkill has cultivated for the last 10 to 12 years or so. Which is a more thrash-oriented sound, speedier and thrashier, and less focus on the heavy groove metal sounding riffs. But this is still in the era of Overkill that I no longer really listen to, simply because they made better albums since. Next. In 14th place we have The Killing Kind, and when I thought of doing this list, I was pretty sure that I was going to put The Killing Kind towards the bottom of the list. But after listening to the album a couple of more times here, for the first time in years, it grew a bit on me. Sure, it's kinda groovy, but the songwriting is quite competent on this album. And I'm not going to say that the album fully redeemed itself, but I no longer hold it as one of the worst Overkill albums. This was also the first album with the then new guitar duo Joe Comeau and Sebastian Marino that stayed with the band for a 5-year period, and it's my least favorite era of Overkill. So I think it was the right decision when they both left the band. Next. In 13th place we have Killbox 13, and I also bought this album when it came out. I remember that I really liked the song Devil by the Tail, which I still think is a pretty cool track. And this might just be my favorite Overkill album from that thrash/groove era that lasted for about 10 to 12 years, from the mid-90s and forward. And this was the band's first record with their new guitarist, Derek the Skull Taylor, and with his arrival, things started sounding a bit better in my opinion. So if you're unfamiliar with that period of Overkill, then you should definitely check out Killbox 13. In 12th place I put I Hear Black from 93, or as I like to call it, I Hear Black Sabbath, because this album is definitely more doomy than their previous records. And they started to experiment a little bit more on this album. The production is still somewhat old school sounding though. And just listen to the song Spiritual Void, there is definitely some Black Sabbath worship going on there. But the album just isn't as good as their previous couple of records, so next. In 11th place we have W.F.O, which came out a year after I Hear Black that we just talked about. But this album is a bit different. The bass on this album is very intense, so much that it gets a bit overwhelming at times. And this album is a bit thrashier than I Hear Black, so I dig the album for that. Where It Hurts, Gasoline Dream and Bastard Nation are cool tracks from W.F.O. And this song Rip Undone was a tribute to Savatage Chris Oliva, who passed away the year before. So that one is also worth checking out. Next. In 10th place we have their latest studio album Rings of War. And of their last handful of albums, this is the album that I liked the least. It's still very fast and thrashing, but some of the songs on this album is a bit weaker in my opinion. Distortion is a rather cool song though, with the calmer intro and some interesting guitar work. But the album as a whole is rather forgettable for me, so next. And now we're on the top half of my list. So in 9th place I put White Devil Armory from 2014. And the first thing that comes to mind about White Devil Armory is the song Armorist, which they recorded a music video for. It's a very frenetic and quite solid thrasher, and the same can be said about the whole album actually. It's a rather intense one, and it's definitely worth checking out, if you for some reason haven't already. Next. In 8th place we have The Grinding Wheel from 2017. And this album is quite similar to White Devil Armory that we just talked about. It's tight, cool sounding thrash from the Green Mean Killing Machine. Is it their finest hour? No, but it's a pretty cool album nonetheless. Next. In 7th place we have The Electric Age. And even if I haven't listened that much to this album, I must say that I'm quite impressed by it now, when I went back and listened to these albums again for the first time in a couple of years. It's rather insane that it's already 9 years since this album came out. It feels more like 2 or 3 years. And you hear a lot about Ironbound, but people don't talk that much about The Electric Age. But they really should, because this is one of the better Overkill albums of the last 30 years or so. Next. In 6th place we have Ironbound that I just mentioned. And when this album came out, it was like the second coming of Thrash Jesus or something like that. This album was hyped as a modern day masterpiece when it came out. And it's a great record, maybe even one of the best thrash albums of the decade. But for me, it's only my number 6. So, next. In 5th place we have Under the Influence from 1988. And now we are in the classic era of Overkill, when guitarist Bobby Gustafson was still in the band. Hello from the Gutter is my favorite track on the album, and it's a cool song that they still play live to this day. Shred, Drunken Wisdom and Overkill 3 are cool songs as well. But for me, this was the weakest album from the Bobby Gustafson years, when the band was still in their prime. And this was also the band's first album with their new drummer Sid Falk. So, next. In 4th place we have 1989's The Years of Decay. And I know that a lot of people hold this as their number 1 Overkill record. But for me, this album is a bit unfocused. I wanted it to be thrashier. It's not as raging as some of their other albums from this time period. Elimination and Time to Kill are cool songs. But tracks like Evil Never Dies, The Birth of Tension, Who Tends the Fire and The Years of Decay aren't exactly the type of songs that I want from this band. I like it more when they pick up some pace. The only song here that I'm not a big fan of is I Hate, which has rather silly lyrics. But The Years of Decay is still an album that all thrashers should buy. Next. In third place we have Horrorscope from '91, and this was the band's first album without Bobby Gustafson. And they proved it right away that there was life after Gustafson, which must have been a worry for most Overkill fans at the time. The legendary guitarist that appears on all of their classic records was gone, but Overkill replaced him with not one but two guitarists in Merritt Gant and Rob Canavino. And they stepped up and delivered right away, and songs like Coma, Thanks for Nothing and Horoscope are cool. Next. In second place we have Overkill's debut album Feel the Fire from 1985, and this was one of the best thrash debuts in my opinion. It sounds like they listened a bit to Paul Di'Anno era of Iron Maiden when they wrote this album, but it also has this kind of New York punk sound to it. Rotten to the Core, Raise the Dead, There's No Tomorrow, Feel the Fire and Overkill. There are so many good songs on this album. And this is definitely a thrash classic, but I also think that this album is somewhat still underrated. Next. And the best Overkill album of all time is, in my opinion, 1987's Taking Over. And this album bridges the gap perfectly between the band's debut album Feel the Fire and albums like Under the Influence and The Years of Decay. They just wrote faster songs during this time period, but they also improved a bit as musicians. And they probably had a bigger budget by now as well, when they were signed to Atlantic Records. And Taking Over is an all-killer, no-filler thrash record. Deny the Cross, Wrecking Crew, Power Surge, In Union We Stand, come on. Those are excellent songs and amongst the best thrashers that Overkill ever wrote. So for me, Taking Over is my number one. So let's have a look at my full list now, and you can clearly see the different eras here in my ranking. The albums that I disliked the most came out from the mid-90s and forward. And in the middle here we have their more recent albums, but I hold their classic era as their best, and by that I mean their 1985 debut album Feel the Fire, up to the release of Horrorscope in '91. After that they struggled a bit for 15 years or so, before they started to climb back with albums like Killbox 13, Ironbound and The Electric Age. And if you ask me to rank these albums again in a month or so, I might have moved them around a bit. Some days I think that Feel the Fire is their best, other days it's Taking Over, or perhaps Horoscope or The Years of Decay. It kinda depends on what mood I'm in, but overall I think that this list is quite solid. I would for example never move Necroshine to the top, that I'm sure of. And now I'm curious to hear about your favorite Overkill records. If you have any favorites, or if you're familiar with all of their records, feel free to rank their full discography down below. And if you're mean and green, then smash that like button and subscribe, because I plan to do more Rank 'Em All videos here on the channel soon. But I haven't decided on what band I should take on next, so let me know whose discography I should rank in the next Rank 'Em All video. And if you want to support my work, I'm on Patreon, and the Ruthless metal store is always open. And feel free to join my community over on Discord as well. We are a few hundred metal fans there now, so you're all welcome to join, and it's absolutely free of course. I also have a thrash metal playlist on Spotify that I think is worth checking out. Or join the Facebook group, all my links are listed down below. And that's all folks, thanks for nothing, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.